This is the Eritrea national football team, and it no longer exists. There are currently 211 men's national football teams associated with FIFA, ranging from Argentina and France at the top of the world rankings, down to Anguilla and San Marino, two tiny territories with fewer than 50,000 inhabitants between them, all the way down at the bottom. Yet, there is one FIFA-affiliated national team which doesn't even have a ranking. Eritrea, with a population of over 3.5 million people, is about 250 times the size of Anguilla, 10 times the size of Iceland, who ranked 72nd, and about the same size as Croatia, who ranked 10th, having finished 2nd and 3rd at the last two FIFA World Cups. At the 2019 CECAFA Cup, despite being the lowest ranked team heading into the tournament, ranked 205th out of 211 teams worldwide, Eritrea beat Burundi and Djibouti, drew with Somalia, and thrashed Kenya 4-1 en route to the final, making it their best ever performance in the oldest competition in African football. And yet, Eritrea's men's team haven't played a single competitive fixture since that tournament, or a match of any description since January 2020, when they lost 1-0 at home against their neighbours Sudan. That was over 4 years ago, and since FIFA only ranks national teams who played a match in the last 48 months, it makes Eritrea the only unranked men's team on the planet. Russia, despite being suspended by both FIFA and UEFA, have played 14 games in the last 2 years alone. Greenland, who aren't even affiliated with a confederation, let alone FIFA, have played 5 games during that same time, and even the Vatican City, the smallest sovereign state on the planet, population just 825, have played a game more recently than Eritrea. And there's no sign of things changing anytime soon. Eritrea have already pulled out of 2025 Africa Cup of Nations qualifying, and they are the only national team on the planet to have withdrawn from 2026 World Cup qualifying. It is a devastating setback for Eritrean football, following the high point of the 2019 CECAFA Cup, in a country that hasn't had much to cheer about, both within and outside of football, throughout its troubled recent and distant past. Eritrea is one of the poorest, most repressive, and most militarized countries in the world, which has led some to describe the young East African nation, which only gained formal independence in 1993, as Africa's North Korea. Conscription is mandatory in Eritrea for both men and women, and can be indefinite, ending only when the country's one-party state, led by a dictator, Isaias Afwerki, says so. All of that is relevant as to why Eritrea are the only inactive national team in world football. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to the Horn of Africa, as we take a look at the strange death of Eritrea's national football team, where they've disappeared to, and what it tells us about quite possibly the most isolated and worst run state in the world. Eritrea only gained independence at the beginning of the 1990s, but football was introduced to the territory by the Italians during the first half of the 20th century. Italy began colonising what is now Eritrea during the mid to late 1800s. In 1869, just 2 days before the Suez Canal opened, the Rubattino Shipping Company purchased the port city of Assab on the Red Sea. In 1882, a year after Raffaele Rubattino died, the Rubattino Shipping Company, and by extension, the port city of Assab, came under the direct control of the Italian government. In 1885, the Italians began occupying Massawa, Eritrea's other major port city on the Red Sea, about 300 miles north of Assab. Although access and control of the Red Sea was of utmost importance to the Italians, most Eritreans, both at the time and still to this day, actually live inland. That's because Eritrea's fertile interior mountains provide more livable conditions and better opportunities for growing crops than the country's arid coastline. Eventually, though, the Italians decided that they wanted it all and more, waging an undeclared war of expansion with the Ethiopian Empire, which lasted a little over 2 years. The end result was the Treaty of Wuchale, a compromise which effectively handed Italy what is modern-day Eritrea, so ample access to the Red Sea, whilst the Ethiopian Empire maintained what is now Ethiopia, and in 1890, the colony of Eritrea was officially founded. Beyond the Red Sea, Italy didn't take much interest in Eritrea for the next 30 to 40 years. That all changed after fascist dictator Benito Mussolini seized power in 1922. Mussolini was obsessed with expansion in Africa, seeking to unite Italy's colonies in Eritrea and Somaliland by conquering the Ethiopian Empire and forming a much larger colony called Italian East Africa. Eritrea would provide the launchpad for Italy's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia, and it was at this point, during the 1930s, that Italian investment, infantry, and culture began flooding into Eritrea. It's for that reason that if you visit the Eritrean capital of Asmara, which not many people do, Eritrea is one of the least visited countries in the world for reasons that will soon become clear, but if you did, still to this day you would find Italian architecture, old Fiats, a flourishing cafe culture and coffee scene, pizza and pasta restaurants, and gelato galore. So much gelato, which is much needed in what is one of the hottest countries in the world. Many older Eritreans still speak fluent Italian with such perfect accents that, with your eyes closed, even a native Italian wouldn't necessarily be able to identify that they were from Asmara rather than Venice or Rome. In 1936, during the same year that Italy defeated the Ethiopian Empire and Italian East Africa was founded, in a seismic conflict that would have long-lasting impacts upon the alliances that formed during the Second World War, Eritrea's first amateur football league was also founded. Initially, there were separate leagues for the Italian colonialists and the native Eritrean teams, but eventually the two would form, and the Eritrean League was even fully incorporated into the Italian League system at Serie D level, the fourth tier of the Italian Football Federation's pyramid. Clubs had names like Asmara Calcio, Gruppo Rionale Negali, and the slightly more sinister Juventus Universitario Fascista. In 1938, Italian architect and businessman Francesco Cicero designed Italy's first purpose-built football stadium in Asmara, which not only still stands to this day, and not only still bears its colonial name, the Cicero Stadium, but is actually the largest stadium in Eritrea and was, until their strange death, the official home of the Eritrea national team, along with 4 club sides. Italian East Africa wouldn't last long though. I won't give you a comprehensive rundown of how World War II went, but by the end of it, Hitler was dead in a bunker having shot himself in the head, Mussolini was executed by communists and hung upside down from a metal girder above a petrol station, and Emperor Hirohito was forced to renounce his divinity and admit that he was human after all. So you can probably deduce from that the Axis powers didn't get on very well. Italy actually lost East Africa during the Allied East African Campaign, which was the first major Allied victory during the war, all the way back in 1941, when it became clear that, for all of Mussolini's jingoism, the Italian military was woefully ill-equipped to wage war against modern European armies. Britain subsequently occupied Eritrea for the next decade until a long-term resolution was determined by the United Nations. Britain wasn't all that interested in Eritrea, especially during a post-war period in which its empire was crumbling, and proposed that Eritrea be divided along religious lines, with the territory's Muslim population joining Sudan and the Christians Ethiopia. The Soviets, meanwhile, proposed handing Eritrea back to the Italians, believing that the communists would soon be elected there, thus bringing Eritrea under the Soviet sphere of influence, and even proposed administering the country themselves. Following decades of foreign occupation, Eritrean leftists wanted independence, most conservatives favoured Ethiopian crown rule, and then there were a lot of people somewhere in the middle. Bloody centrists. In the end, the UN General Assembly settled upon making Eritrea an autonomous region of the Ethiopian Empire, linked to Ethiopia via the same loose federal structure, but with its own political leadership, laws, flag, domestic affairs, taxation, and most of the other things that one would typically associate with a sovereign state. I promise you this is all relevant to why Eritrea haven't played a football match in over 4 years, but even if it wasn't, who doesn't want to learn more about Eritrea? And so, in 1952, the Federation of Ethiopia and Eritrea was formed, but again, it would be short-lived. From the word go, Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie sought to undermine Eritrea's autonomy, and in 1962, Ethiopia breached UN Resolution 390A and annexed Eritrea as a province of the Ethiopian Empire rather than an autonomous region. Unsurprisingly, not all Eritreans were best pleased with being annexed by Ethiopia, and in response to Ethiopia's annexation, the Eritrean Liberation Front was founded. the ELF, not to be confused with the EFL, which is the English Football League, and later the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, or EPLF, waged a 30-year war of independence against Ethiopia. No, you heard me right. It took 30 years, spanning all the way from 1961 to 1991. During that time, Ethiopia itself underwent a revolution in which the old empire and monarchy were abolished, and a Marxist-Leninist communist state was established, and the Ethiopian Civil War spanned some 16 years and claimed more than 1.5 million lives, including deaths caused by famine. In the end, the EPLF, not to be confused with either the ELF, the EFL, or the EPL, emerged victorious in 1991, and in 1993, 99.83% of Eritreans voted in favour of independence and separation from Ethiopia. The following month, Eritrea, really for the first time in its history, became both a de facto and de jure independent state. Right, so, what about football? Well, football in Eritrea had continued to be popular following its introduction via the Italians in the 1930s, and a number of Eritreans represented the Ethiopian national team prior to independence, who were powerhouses of the African game in the 1950s and 60s. To put the size difference between Ethiopia and Eritrea in some context at this stage, Eritrea had a population of fewer than 1 million people in 1960, compared to more than 20 million in Ethiopia, and less than 2 million by 1993, when it became independent, compared to over 50 million in Ethiopia. It's surprising, therefore, that a decent number of Eritreans represented Ethiopia, and did so with distinction. Eritrea's independent national team played their first unofficial fixture in 1992, and the Eritrean Premier League, which will always be the real EPL in my view, was founded in 1994. But it wasn't until 1996 that the Eritrean National Football Federation declared its first statutes and was therefore officially founded, and Eritrea didn't become FIFA and CAF affiliated, allowing them to compete in competitions like the Africa Cup of Nations and the World Cup, until 1998. Eritrea's national football team are, or were perhaps I should say, nicknamed the Red Sea Boys, principally because Eritrea's strategic location on the Red Sea, bordering Ethiopia, Sudan and Djibouti, and less than 20 miles from mainland Yemen at the narrowest point of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, is very important to them, but perhaps also because most of their players, historically, have been drawn from a team called Red Sea FC. Founded in 1945, under British military occupation, Red Sea FC are one of 4 Asmara-based teams who play at the Cicero Stadium, and they have been crowned Eritrean champions no fewer than 13 times. No other team has won the Eritrean Premier League more than 3 times. In 2011, after appearing at the Kagame Interclub Cup in Tanzania, where they reached the quarter-finals, 13 members of the Red Sea FC squad didn't return home, instead heading straight to the offices of the UNHCR, that is, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in Dar es Salaam to seek protection as refugees. Given that Red Sea FC supplied Eritrea's national team with most of their players, this was a bit of a problem for Eritrean football, but it was far from a one-off for Eritrean players. In fact, it wasn't even the first time that it had happened specifically with Red Sea players. 4 Red Sea players escaped their minders and sought asylum in Kenya after a CAF Champions League game in Nairobi in 2006. 7 Eritrean runners sought political asylum in the United Kingdom following the 2008 World Cross Country Championship in Edinburgh, and 12 Eritrean internationals, so about half of the entire squad, successfully sought asylum in Kenya after reaching the quarter-finals of the 2009 CECAFA Cup, also in Nairobi. In December 2012, the entire Eritrea squad disappeared after getting knocked out of the CECAFA Cup in Uganda, resurfacing at the UNHCR offices in Kampala in order to claim asylum. They spent the next 6 months in a brutal refugee compound in Uganda, before being transferred to the city of Timișoara in Romania, and then finally onto the picturesque city of Gorinchem in the Netherlands. The story of an entire national football team, after going through hell, collectively being relocated to a small city in South Holland, captured the public imagination and made national news in the Netherlands. Some locals and news reporters pitched up to watch what was, effectively, an entire national football team that no longer had a nation to represent train, with some local clubs sending their scouts to try and hoover up the best talents. The short-lived left-wing mayor of Gorinchem, Anton Besk, was keen to welcome the refugee team, describing it as, quote, a romantic story where a group of young people are defecting from their country for all of the best reasons. Adding, quote, they are a national soccer team and we are a very hospitable country and city here, so we never hesitated in welcoming them. End quote. Not everyone was quite so welcoming of Eritrea's international football team. The far-right Party for Freedom, or PPV, who won the most votes of any single party in the most recent Dutch general election, even with only 23% of the vote, tabled a motion in the Dutch parliament asking why the players had been allowed to enter the country and given housing. Geert Wilders, leader of the PPV, both then and now, stated, quote, of course people are angered by this. It is no wonder that thousands of Eritreans now seem to think that they are welcome in the Netherlands and that welfare benefits are waiting for them. End quote. The 12 players who disappeared in 2009, meanwhile, were eventually resettled in Australia. Several of them went on to become full professionals and play in the A-League, the top flight of Australian football. In total, at least 89, and most likely in excess of 100 Eritrean footballers, haven't returned home from matches or tournaments in foreign countries since 2009 alone. When you think that not many Eritrean players actually get to go abroad, it's only really Red Sea or whoever the national champions happens to be, and then the national team themselves, which more often than not have been very similar squads, it is an extraordinarily high percentage of players who have taken the opportunity to flee the country. It's not just footballers. Over 800,000 Eritreans have fled since independence, over 300,000 of them resettling in ostensibly liberal democratic countries, out of a population of just 3.68 million. A brain drain doesn't quite do justice to what Eritrea suffers from. It is more akin to a total drain of both blue and white-collar workers, parents and children. Somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 adults born in Eritrea are believed to have permanently relocated to other countries, despite the fact that Eritrea grants virtually no one permission to leave temporarily or to permanently emigrate. There is a reason, after all, why some people describe Eritrea as Africa's North Korea. When Eritrea declared formal independence in May 1993, Isaias Afwerki, leader of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which emerged victorious from the 30-year Eritrean War of Independence, became the president of Eritrea. More than 3 decades on, and now aged 78, Afwerki remains the only person ever to have held that office. After the end of Eritrea's War of Independence, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front became the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, or the PFDJ, which is an ironic name, the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, given that they are the only legal party in Eritrea. All other political parties are officially outlawed. Any and all political opponents are brutally suppressed. Eritrea has never held any national elections since gaining independence in 1993. Afwerki is the chairman of the People's Front of Democracy and Justice, as well as the president of Eritrea, and as for justice itself, the PFDJ and Afwerki have complete control of the judiciary. It's for that reason that Eritrea has been described as one of the most totalitarian states on earth. In 2022, Reporters Without Borders ranked Eritrea 180th out of 180 countries in its Press Freedom Index, below Syria, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia. They were bumped up 6 places in the 2023 rankings, woohoo, moving 1 spot above Syria, but still some way below the likes of Russia, Afghanistan, and Yemen. It's hardly a ringing endorsement, is it? Eritrea is one of the world's least developed countries, according to the UN, and the least democratic country in Africa, despite some seriously stiff competition. It is one of the poorest countries in the world, both in absolute but especially per capita terms, with an estimated GDP per capita of just $644, putting it below the likes of Mozambique, DR Congo, and, yes, even North Korea. That's partly because Eritrea isn't rich in natural resources, at least not in terms of oil or gas like the nearby dictatorship of Saudi Arabia, and the country faces a tough time farming and growing crops in hot, harsh, and semi-desert conditions, but it's also due to the almost unique way in which Eritrea's economy is run. One of the world's only true command economies, which is another reason why Eritrea is compared to North Korea, the PFDJ aren't just totalitarian, they're also totally incompetent. Eritrea operates a wartime economy, even when the country isn't actually at war. Defense or military spending in Eritrea fluctuates wildly between a base of about 10% and a high in excess of 20% of the nation's GDP. That compares to 3.45% in the United States, the country with the highest military spending in the world. Only Ukraine, post-2022, for what I would imagine are fairly obvious reasons, and, you guessed it, North Korea, spend a high percentage of their GDP on their armed forces. Conscription has been mandated in the Constitution of Eritrea since 1995, requiring all able-bodied men and women to serve ostensibly for 18 months. Those 18 months are supposed to consist of 6 months of military training, followed by 12 months working on national reconstruction projects. Initially, conscription was justified by fears of aggression from Eritrea's neighbours, and the 12 months of work on reconstruction projects by Eritrea's lack of resources, reluctance to receive foreign aid, and the vast amount of reconstruction that was required following 30 years of civil war. Within 7 years of gaining independence, Eritrea had gone to war with Yemen, Sudan, Zaire, and most notably Ethiopia, with the 2-year Eritrean-Ethiopian War, which was triggered by Eritrea invading Ethiopia, resulting in a military defeat for Eritrea and as many as 300,000 people losing their lives, a little over half of them on the Eritrean side. That was used by Afwerki and the PFDJ to justify even more militarism, and a further 30 years on from independence and the end of the civil war, Eritrean conscription is now described by many people, including a number of defectors, as being indistinguishable from slavery. Eritrean men and women, or boys and girls, are taken from their final year at school to the Sava Defense Training Center in the Gashbarka region of Eritrea, less than 20 miles from the border with Sudan, officially at the age of 18, though there are claims of children being sent there or even younger, and though they are ostensibly only conscripted for 18 months, they're actually conscripted indefinitely. The Constitution of Eritrea states that all able-bodied men and women must serve for 18 months, but that during times of national crisis, that period may be extended. Well, conveniently for Afwerki and the PFDJ, Eritrea is always in a state of national crisis. As a result, Eritreans are routinely conscripted for several years, decades, and even for their entire working lives. There are Eritreans now in their 40s and 50s who were conscripted at the beginning of the 1990s, and they work in every industry, not just reconstruction. Doctors, nurses, and teachers could all be conscripts, and actually tend to be conscripted for even longer than possibly less skilled or highly trained workers due to the importance of their roles. Because they are conscripts, though, the government is only required to pay them 450 Eritrean nat for a month, equivalent to about $30, putting them well below the global extreme poverty line of $2.15 a day, which works out at $64.50 a month, more than double what an Eritrean conscript makes. This is a form of compulsory, indefinite work, or servitude in fact, which is illegal to avoid or escape from, punishable by imprisonment and even torture, which is rewarded with a salary so low that it doesn't come close to being livable, even in one of the lowest income countries in the world. It is difficult to see how it doesn't meet the definition of slavery, and very easy to see why so many Eritreans, and especially young Eritreans, are so desperate to leave. That's why Eritrea has the highest number of refugees and displaced people per capita of any country in the world that isn't currently involved in an ongoing conflict. If you're thinking, well, surely footballers, at least those good enough to represent Eritrea on the international stage, must be exempt from conscription, well, I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you. Footballers are also conscripts, and there is no fully professional football league, team or players in Eritrea, requiring them to juggle their careers and matches with their mandatory military service and whatever other job they are forced to perform as part of their conscription. The only way in which Eritrea's footballers are unique, or at least the nation's best players, is in the opportunities that they have historically been afforded in order to escape. The right to travel freely is denied to almost all Eritreans, with the exception of high-ranking politicians, officials, and athletes. Politicians and officials, though they too have made escapes in rare instances, obviously have some skin in the game. But athletes have fled Eritrea at a rate which is unrivaled by any other country in the world. Whereas Eritrean footballers have typically only had to escape from their minders whilst competing in foreign countries, heading straight for the nearest UNHCR offices and applying for asylum, ordinary Eritreans face a much more daunting route out, typically via the nation's land borders, where border guards are instructed to shoot to kill, into either Ethiopia or Sudan, two of the world's most dangerous countries, make their way to and then through Libya, another troubled country, shall we just say, before making the most dangerous leg of their journey of all, across the Mediterranean Sea, almost certainly in a vessel woefully ill-equipped to make the journey, and with hostile border guards seeking to prevent their entry into Europe, often with little regard for human life. In 2023 alone, UNHCR recorded that more than 3,000 people seeking asylum lost their lives at sea. Some Eritrean footballers have even talked about the opportunities to escape Eritrea with a reduced risk of being captured, tortured or killed as having been one of their primary motivations to make it in football and to reach the top of the Eritrean game, so they would be able to go on those trips abroad. For most of us who grew up playing football, and possibly dreaming of becoming footballers ourselves, the idea of that being a motive, or even factoring into our thinking, could hardly be more alien. For others, their love of the game, and ambitions within the sport, can serve as another motivation to try and get out. As I mentioned before, football in Eritrea, even in the Eritrean Premier League, is part-time and semi-professional, alongside conscription, and it is vanishingly rare that permission is granted for players to progress their careers by playing overseas. Alexander Isak, the fifth highest scorer in the Premier League this season with 17 goals, who joined Newcastle United for £63 million in 2022, was born to Eritrean parents in Solna, Sweden in 1999. Isak's parents fled war-torn Eritrea before independence was declared during the 1980s, seeking a better life in Sweden. This was ironically celebrated in the British newspaper The Sun as a feel-good story after Isak joined Newcastle, despite the fact that the Murdoch-owned paper, like almost all of Murdoch's media empire, prints wall-to-wall hatred of refugees and attempts to portray all asylum seekers as, at best, lazy scroungers and, at worst, subhuman violent criminals. Isak is now possibly Sweden's best player, meanwhile fellow Swedish international Tesvaldet Teki was actually born in Asmara, but his family escaped when he was 9 years old. Formerly of Fortuna Sittard and Go Ahead Eagles in the Netherlands, he now plays for Hammarby in the Allsvenskan. There are players from the Eritrean diaspora playing football all around the world. Almost all of them either refugees or the children of refugees. And it is a certainty that there is a wellspring of young talent in Eritrea, not just in football but in all fields, that will never be realised due to the country's political, economic, and military settlement. Had Alexander Isak been born in Asmara rather than Solna, and his parents not fled Eritrea, you almost certainly never would have heard of him. As it happens, he's now valued at more than £100 million and linked to clubs which are valued at more than Eritrea's annual GDP. In October 2019, 2 months before Eritrea's men's team played their last competitive fixtures, reaching the final of the CECAFA Cup, 4 members of the country's under-20 team escaped while competing in the under-20 CECAFA Cup in Uganda. The men's team haven't played a home game since that incident. Heading into the 2025 AFCON and 2026 World Cup qualification campaigns, Eritrea faced an even bigger headache when it came to potential defections. The Cicero Stadium, built in 1938 under Italian occupation and renovated twice since, once while Eritrea was an autonomous region within the Ethiopian Empire in 1958, and for a second time following independence in 2005, no longer meets CAF standards for hosting international matches. As a result, Eritrea would have been prohibited from hosting any fixtures in AFCON and World Cup qualifying, and would have been forced to play both their home and, naturally, their away games outside of Eritrea. That posed a serious risk of even greater escapes and asylum claims by Eritrean footballers than usual, which has long been a source of humiliation for Afwerki and the PFDJ, who have consistently denied that large numbers of young Eritreans have either left or seek to leave Eritrea. That was a risk, particularly after another 5 members of Eritrea's women's team fled before a match against Uganda in November 2021, which Eritrea couldn't countenance. Hence the decision to pull out of both competitions, and why Eritrea is the only unranked national team not to have played a game in the last 4 years in the entire world. No official explanation has been provided, still, for Eritrea's withdrawal from international football competitions and the national team's hiatus. A tacit admission, if nothing else, by the Afwerki regime of the fact that people do indeed want to leave. Football isn't the biggest problem currently facing Eritrea or Eritreans, but in a nation with much talent, as its diaspora population and refugees continue to illustrate, it comes as yet another devastating blow. Many Eritreans who have escaped, footballers or otherwise, live in constant fear of government agents capturing or killing them, or their host countries sending them back. Egypt has previously sent Eritrean refugees back to Eritrea without assessing their asylum claims, leading to them being imprisoned, tortured, and disappeared. Here too, there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the motives of many refugees. If you speak to or just listen to many Eritrean escapees, what they fear most isn't death, courtesy of the bullet of a border guard, or capsizing in the Mediterranean. They see that as a risk that is worth taking to escape a much worse fate of slavery, torture, and imprisonment. The Afwerki regime is renowned for its particularly brutal punishment of detainees, ranging from crumbling underground concrete cells, overcrowded with political prisoners held without trial, and most notably torture chambers known as the Oven, in which prisoners are locked in shipping containers in the searing heat and effectively left to cook. Africa's North Korea may be a bit of a lazy tag in some respects. Eritreans, though still extremely limited, have much better access to the internet and the outside world than North Koreans, and the cult of personality which surrounds Afwerki is much less extreme than that which surrounds Kim Jong-un and the Kim dynasty as a whole. In other ways, however, Eritrea is even more isolated than North Korea. North Korea's 2 biggest allies, China and Russia, have the world's 2nd and 11th largest economies, and the most and the 3rd most nuclear warheads. Meanwhile, Pakistan, Iran, Madagascar, and even Bulgaria enjoy cordial relations with Kim. Eritrea, by contrast, has virtually no friends on the international stage. They have extremely tense relations with most of their neighbours, having been to war with practically all of them since gaining independence. They are observers of the Arab League, but not full members, and have been to war with 2 Arab League member nations. Afwerki has been honoured by Saudi Arabia, Serbia, and the United Arab Emirates, and has sought closer ties with Russia since Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Along with Belarus, Syria, and, yes, it is our old friends again, North Korea, Eritrea was one of only 4 countries, not including Russia, to vote against a United Nations General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and in 2023, Afwerki voiced his support for Russia's invasion. We can probably call Russia Eritrea's closest allies at this point, therefore, but even that relationship is strained. In October 2022, Eritrea didn't vote in line with Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Nicaragua, and Syria against a UN resolution denouncing the sham referendums held in the Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia oblasts and demanding Russia's immediate withdrawal, but instead abstained. Afwerki is one of few world leaders to have attempted to have positive relations with both Israel and Iran, leading to both to be suspicious of him. Meanwhile, the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom have all imposed sanctions on Eritrea, which probably aren't particularly helpful given how crippled the economy already is, and there are reports that yet another war with Ethiopia could be on the horizon. Eritrea, therefore, is one of the most troubled countries in the world, both on the pitch and off it. Whereas most countries have armies, Eritrea is an army that has a country. Afwerki is paranoid, economically illiterate, and knows nothing other than force. The end result is one of the poorest, most isolated, most indebted, and most militarized countries in the world, where every citizen can effectively be enslaved or at least reduced to impoverished serfdom. Eritrean football, which has boundless potential, has been hamstrung by conscription, the refusal to allow players to leave freely, and, ultimately now, the fear of further defections and the embarrassment that comes with them. The Afwerki regime hopes that by shutting down Eritrea's national team and denying their players the opportunity to travel to foreign countries, they'll receive less bad press than if they were to turn up, and yet more players inevitably defect. I don't think that is the case, or at least it shouldn't be, which is partly why I made this video. On that note, that is it for today's video. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you, maybe enjoyed is the wrong word, but found it interesting or informative. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, it goes without saying at this stage, make sure that you are subscribed not just to this channel, HITC Sevens, and have notifications turned on, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, which I'm trying to get to 25,000 subscribers. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username @HITC Sevens on all three, should you wish to do so. And all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.